The godswood of Winterfell was older than the walls that hemmed it in, and older, perhaps, than the words carved into the heart of the weirwood's pale face. A hush lay beneath its red leaves even when the yard beyond rang with steel, a hush like held breath. The pools steamed in winter and summer both, and on cold mornings thin ripples of warmth shivered out across the surface where snowflakes died upon it. She had learned to sit very still at the lip of the largest pool and hold her hands over the water to warm them, to listen to the trees' faint whisper and measure out each breath with patience. She did not know if the heart tree's eyes looked at her or through her, but when she was small she had told its secrets in a toddler's whisper, and as she grew she learned to keep the best of them in the hollow of her chest where even the old gods could not find them. They called her Narya in Winterfell, which name belonged to a girl who had died somewhere in the south in a petty border raid no songs remembered. Her hair was brown as a doe's, and sometimes the dye of walnut husk left a sheen almost black. Her eyes were a strangeness, lilac gone near gray, and Maester Luwin had told the cooks and grooms, the women at their spinning and the guards at their mead, that it was the mark of a Lyseni grandmother. The yarders shrugged. The north saw many queer things. Crannogmen in leather armor slick with swamp water, men with sealskin cloaks from the bays, Ironborn's hard scowls. Pale eyes did not sharpen a scythe nor stack the winter stores. Let the girl have her oddness. She worked. She listened when spoken to. She never forgot a task. When the Lord of Winterfell himself found her seated at the pool, the hush shifted the way it did when a stag put a careful hoof on frosted ground. His shadow fell across the water, long and solid, and she looked up. "Narya," Eddard Stark said, in the voice that held iron more than frost. "You have a lesson with Maester Luwin." "I finished the reading," she said. "I copied the letters twice. The Maester said I might have the hour, my lord." He gave a small nod and stood with her. The scar at his ankle made a sound she only heard when the godswood was quiet and everything else kept its breath. A tiny hitch in his step that made no less of him. He wore no cloak. The cold seemed to respect him. When they went out of the gate into the low winter light, the yard was full of motion. Robb with his hair like a fox's pelt, broadening in the shoulders. Jon, lean and book-silent and devastatingly precise with a wooden blade. Theon Greyjoy all laughter, as if the sound could charm warmth out of the wind. The ring of practiced swords and the barked orders of Ser Roderick layered over the smell of horse and smoke. "Have you eaten?" Lord Eddard asked. "Yes, my lord." "You may say yes, Lord Stark." His mouth slanted. He had never required naming, but Catelyn wished it, and in the hall she hung silence on courtesy like a guarded veil. Narya had learned early to cross it with soft feet. "Yes, Lord Stark," she said, and because his eyes were not cold she added, "The oatcakes were a little burned. I told Gage to remind the scullions that there's smoke enough from Micken's forge," he said. "You'll come to the hall at midday. I'd speak with you and Maester Luwin." Her pulse pressed once at her throat. The word speak meant nothing yet everything here. And though fear had been scoured out of her by endless patient caution, fear had roots that sent up fresh shoots in the dark. She bowed her head and went toward the library tower. Maester Luwin kept his room warm with braziers, and the chains on his throat glinted. He made her read out a passage on the kings of winter of long ago and on the first night's king, a lesson old Nan had once adorned with ghosts taller than the hall. Luwin's ghosts were smaller and walked more in the footnotes, but Narya listened because she caught in him a care she recognized in Lord Eddard, the care of men who did not make a gift of their warmth to the world, but kept it banked and offered it only to those who had need. The bells sounded for midday. In the great hall, Catelyn sat near the dais with Sansa at her side, her needlework a subtle badge of favor. Narya knew 100 small things about the lady, how her courtesy could become a blade, how her dislike could be expressed in the efficiency of orders that carefully did not include the person unwelcome. It was never overt. Catelyn Tully of Riverrun had the skill of the south with the prudence of the north. To Narya she offered frost and a place near the hearth. To Jon she offered frost and, if he was lucky, the dignity of being unseen. Narya stood when Lord Eddard rose. Ser Roderick and Hallis Malin bowed and left them. The lady's blue eyes flicked across the hall and away. The old banners stirred. A gust woke the dire wolf at the long hall's end into a ripple of gray on gray. Neria's heart beat in her throat again. "Maester," Lord Eddard said, with no preamble, "tell her the thing we agreed." Luwin's fingers touched the chain at his throat. When he spoke, he did not soften his voice, and for that Neria loved him more. "The king is coming to Winterfell." All the hall settled, as if the very dust remembered. "When?" Neria asked, because she had learned the North's way. Better for a girl to be thought too forward than too stupid. "A fortnight," Lord Eddard said. "Perhaps less if weather is fair." "His grace will bring a great many eyes," Luwin said. "We must be careful of how many look at you." He did not need to explain what they feared. When Neria was very small, she learned to keep her hair covered with thin coifs dyed with nettles and walnut. A few saw it in candlelight when her plait fell out, the white gold glint beneath the brown like frost under turned earth. Those few spoke to no one. Ser Roderick had gnarled hands and a stern mouth and a soft spot for children set to difficult tasks. "You'll stay within the walls," Lord Eddard said. "You'll keep to the library tower, the godswood, the solar when my lady permits it. You'll go to no feast. When the king goes to the crypts, you will not be there." Neria pictured feasts she had never tasted. She pictured the king's face from the tales, the boar, the black beard, the voice that made walls shake. She set her jaw against a disappointment older than she was allowed to name, older than the idea that she had a father's arms somewhere in a storm-drowned memory. "As my lord commands," she said, and looked full at him so he would see she did not flinch. Something eased at the corner of Lord Eddard's mouth. "There will be noise," he said. "Noise and change. We must not let either be our master." She was sent back to her needlework, to Old Nan's corner where the stories drifted out like smoke and the babes lay in nests of furs. Bran climbed, of course. Rickon made a fortress of bread trencher and spilled a cup trying to defend it. Arya had pricked 2 fingers to get Sansa's nose out of her mouth, and Sansa had wept quietly so her mother would see and scold the right child. Jon came late, sweat cooling on his skin, and stood by a pillar as if pillars had been built to be leaned on by boys who did not belong at tables. Neria rose and crossed to him and offered her cup. "Apple cider," she said. His gray eyes flicked to her, and for a heartbeat she thought of winter rivers in thaw, the shock of brightness under dark water. He took the cup. "Thank you." When he handed it back, his fingers were colder than hers. "Ser Roderick says I hold my sword too tight." He sounded like a craftsman's apprentice recalling instruction, not a boy stung by criticism. He absorbed everything. People mistook quiet for softness. Neria had watched the way he bent. "You hold yourself too tight," she said, and only afterward realized it was a thing one would say to a friend. She waited, expecting the space to close between them like a snapped bowstring. But Jon Snow's mouth eased, and the hardness behind his eyes thinned. "I haven't learned how not to." "I don't know either," she said. "Only how to make mending look like it was always meant to be there." Old Nan's voice drifted over them. The tale of the man who went into the barrow and came out with his eyes turned wrong. Arya pricked her finger again and did not flinch. Sansa's needle moved neatly, beautiful little steps across the cloth, and her face was an apple polished for market. The king came as promised, with thunder on the road and dust like banners. Neria watched from a slit above the yard, crouched in the cool guts of Winterfell, and saw the colors like a moving garden. Green and gold, red and crimson, the crowned stag on black, lions roaring on fields the men who bore them did not own. The king had a belly and a laugh that made the yard seem small. He embraced Lord Eddard, and the sound of their hands upon each other's backs was like 2 veterans greeting the scars they shared. Neria did not go to the feast. She watched the last of the retinue pile into the hall, saw the queen's hair like a coin hoard catch the light, saw a small pale man with mismatched eyes measure the yard with a gaze too sharp to seem merry. She drew back into the dark and let the tapestry fall. Those days were a blur of watching and not being seen. When the king hunted, the noise of departure went through the castle like storm wind. Once she saw the queen out of the corner of her eye in the solar, the narrow sheen of her mouth, the tilt of her head listening to Catelyn speak. Catelyn's voice was perfectly smooth as cream. They had the south between them, cool and deep as a river. The castle's breath shifted the day Bran fell. Nerya would remember the sound to her death. Not a cry, but the halt that went through the stone when every living thing within it sucked in air and held it. She was in the corridor with a bowl of broth for old Nan. The bowl shook as she set it down. Then she was running, and the corridor was filled with motion. And Arya had a smear of ash on her cheek where she'd rubbed it from the hearth, and Sansa's face had gone marvelous pale. Catelyn made herself into stone. Bran lived, thanks to gods no one would name and men who'd leaped where men had to. He did not wake. When the catspaw came, Nerya was in the room with Catelyn because she had brought a fresh basin and a cloth and would not leave while Catelyn had to be still beside a son she could not rouse. It happened quickly and in pieces. The man, the blade with edge like a promise, Catelyn's cry, the tangle of bodies, the sudden flash of teeth and fur. Summer snarled, blood hot on white. Catelyn sobbed and fought with fire. Nerya threw the basin in the very stupid hope that water could drown a killing. It smashed on the hearthstone. The shards were bright and meaningless. Later, when the room had been wrathed clean of danger and the fear of a child's stillness had returned, Catelyn turned her eyes on Nerya and said in a voice like the line where water meets ice, "You are to go, my lady." "Out," Catelyn said, and lifted a hand toward the door as if it weighed enough to drag her whole arm down. "You will not be in this room again." Nerya went. She carried the memory of Catelyn's face with her like a splinter under the skin. Catelyn did not have the luxury of rawness often. When she did, Nerya knew she had looked on something forbidden, and that the price would be paid in distance. Jon left with his uncle for the wall. On the morning he rode, the sky had the cruel blue the north knew well, the kind that promises cold without snow and sun without warmth. Nerya found Jon in the yard with his new sword, the gift from his father in everything but name, and a bundle at his saddle. He had not slept. The silence in his eyes was very clean. "I made you this," she said, because she had no other gift. She put into his hands a leather strap she had tooled herself with the patience of winter evenings while the others worked at their embroidery. It had a small pattern of scales down it, embossed and then darkened with oil and ash. Between the scales were the faintest hints of leaves, a pattern even she would have to search to see. It could be used to wrap a sword hilt or to bind the loose leather around a travel sack. Jon ran a thumb across it and raised his eyes fast, as if he knew he had looked too much. "Thank you," he said, his voice roughened. "Nerya, I know," she said, though she did not. She had learned the shape of not asking. "Write if the ravens will carry it. Send word by anyone coming south." He nodded. His eyes moved past her for a heartbeat and fixed on the door that led into the hall. Catelyn stood there, her hand on Bran's wolf, which tolerated her by the grace of the boy it loved. She did not speak to Jon. Jon did not go to her. He bowed his head to the air between them as if it were a lady deserving honor. Then he mounted and rode with Benjen. Arya cried in her ferocious way and hung from him until Robb pried her loose. Sansa dried her eyes while she watched him, as if she could keep them both clear and unclouded if she shaped the tears with will alone. After the king left Winterfell, he took Lord Eddard with him. The day the Raven came with the news of Jon Arryn's death, Nerya held the message for Hallis Malin to carry to the Solar and smelled the sour fear the men of the north hid beneath their good sense. In the days that followed, the hall changed its rhythm to one she did not like. The bold clangor became a taut waiting. The ravens went in and out. A little later there was the letter from Lisa Tully, a flame sent upon water. And then the king himself with his queen, and the long talk in the crypts, and Ned Stark's face carved deeper across the brow when he emerged and found his lady. And at last the morning the Lord rode to take the Hand's badge and a path south. He left Sansa and Arya with him and Bran in his bower and Rickon wild in the yard, and a promise to be swift if the gods were kind. The gods were not kind. Word came staggered and broken, the way bad tidings always chose to arrive. First whispers that the Hand had quarreled with the queen, then that he had resigned, then that the king was dead and all the court a coil of snakes. When the Raven came with the news that Lord Eddard had been seized for treason, Neria held the parchment and felt the world tilt. Luwin sat very still in his chair, like a man recalling a treatise and trying to find which line of reasoning had failed. Catelyn was not there. She had already ridden with Ser Roderick to seize the dwarf at the crossroads, to barter information for safety, to do some impossible thing for a husband 300 leagues away. Robb grew 10 years in 10 days. He called the banners. When the ravens went, Neria stood in the yard and thought of the first time she had seen the hunt ride out, whooping, and how the sound had filled the sky. This was not that sound. It was heavier and lower. It did not expect to return to feasting with stories on its lips. Ser Roderick buckled Robb's sword for him, his eyes bright as a man in whom pride and grief had braided together too tightly to be distinguished. The banners came like winter birds, flock after flock, gray and blue and black, the direwolf rising at the last, so that even men who had never sworn to any but summer remembered that there were castles that had stood through the long night while the world froze. "It will be a hard time," Maester Luwin said to Neria in the solar when the hall had emptied out into noise and motion and logistics. "The young lord goes to win or to die, and Winterfell's work remains. We must order the stores and set the women to weaving as if for 2 winters, not 1. We must have eyes on the road, to know when we should shut our gates and open our hearts to whom." Neria nodded. She had learned to be useful. When she slept that night, she dreamed of the godswood's pool, of steam twisting in the candlelight and of a white face carving her name in silence. In the dream, it did not carve Neria. It carved another word she had never said aloud but knew in the bones of her wrist, like the knowledge you are falling before your feet prove it. Daenerys. She woke with the sound of it on her tongue and went to the mirror in the dark, pulled the tie from her plate, and watched the pale roots of her hair catch the moon like a secret come back from the grave. 3 days later, Maester Luwin asked her to climb the library tower after the noon bell. When she reached the top, she found him with his hand on the window ledge and the parchment heavy in his other palm. He closed the shutters and settled, very old suddenly in a way she had not seen. "I have kept a thing for Lord Eddard," he said. He feared this moment. Neria sat with her hands very still between her knees, as if any motion at all would upset some delicate balance holding the room together. Luwin looked at her steadily. "I do not know the rightness of any of it," he said. "Maesters have chains, so we remember how much binds us. The rightness is for others to settle. I have served the Starks without question for longer than you have lived. I am not a coward, but I have loved my life here, and I have not sought reason to quarrel with it. I tell you this because what I will say now will change what this place is to you. If I could spare you that, I might, but your lord would not have it, and I am not that brave." The candle guttered. She waited. She did not breathe. "You were not born Neria," he said at last. "You were born Daenerys of the House Targaryen, last born of King Aerys, whom men called mad. Your mother died bringing you into the world on Dragonstone. You were smuggled away by those who loved their old house and would not see a babe's head smashed for a king's peace. There were those who sought bravos for you, and they may believe they found it. There were others who were wise with stealth. They put you in a fisher's boat and sent you to a place where wolves had more honor than lions. Lord Eddard buried the truth to keep faith with himself. He will not be thanked for it. Few ever are, for such deeds." The words did not bruise as she had expected. They slid into her like warmth poured into an empty cup. She felt the weight of them lodge in her and knew, with the clean shock of snow-scoured air, that they belonged there. She did not speak for a long time, because if she did she would say the wrong thing and waste it. The room waited with her. At last she said, "Why tell me now?" "Because the men who hated your name most sit presently in power," Luwin said. "Because the world is about to tear itself across the middle, and we should not put you near that seam unknowingly. If the North fails, the men who survive it will seek plunder in these halls. If the North prevails, names will be tools for peace as sharp as swords. In either case, you must know who you are so you may choose. Who else knows?" Her voice did not shake. That made her proud and a little ashamed. "Lord Eddard," said Luwin. "Lord Howland Reed, myself, and a fisherman's daughter who knew a bundle was worth a life. That last is my guess, not my knowledge. The gods may know. Catelyn Stark does not." He paused, and pity went across his face and was crushed into care again. "She has enough to carry." Daenerys, held the banister until the wood's grain made a map against her palm. In her chest something flared and rose, not triumph, not joy, but a clean certainty like the edge of new-forged steel. The name fit like a cloak made for her. It also made her dangerous as a drawn blade. "How will I hide?" she asked. "Once it is known, I will not be allowed to be. We shall dye your hair until we may not," Luwin said. "We shall not call you by your name unless we must. We will wear silence like a mantle and hope it keeps our shape blurred. And if I choose not to hide?" The thought surprised her because she had not known, until asked, that she wanted to know the shape of what she could be without fear. It stood up inside her like a girl at a feast who had decided not to take the bread herself but to wait for her name to be called. "Then," Luwin said, "you will need friends like ships need water." His mouth turned. "And you must be careful to decide what you would be named for. You cannot keep a name like that and be no one." Daenerys nodded. Afterward she went to the godswood and sat before the weirwood and wished she could ask it, as if the face would lean down and tell her something of the future. It did not. The wind stirred, red leaves moved like hands, and somewhere a raven called twice. War came like flint to a napped edge. Robb rode south. Daenerys watched the banners wind away into the world and looked at Winterfell laid out like a body. Ribs of walls, heart of a hall, long limbs of towers, the old bones beneath in the crypts where men who refused to yield to time slept holding iron. She thought of that iron when she walked the halls in the days that followed and set women to spinning as Maester Luwin commanded, and counted sacks, and made a list of every man in the holdfast too old for the muster but not so old he could not stand a watch. She sought Osha in the kitchens, the wildling woman caught by their men on the King's Road, and sat with her over an empty bowl. "What is it you're wanting, little lady?" Osha said, her red hair like a fox's brush and her grin quick. "There are easier folk to ask for small favors." "No easy favors are worth much," Daenerys said, trying out the pride of a name she couldn't use. "What do you know of what lies north?" "The cold," Osha said, and her eyes went soft as if remembering a lover she did not dare touch again. "Wolves as go in packs and go alone. Things move under the snow sometimes that aren't beasts. The air's wrong when they're near. You feel it in your teeth." She put a finger against her lip and tapped it. "Why?" "Because if the South keeps its bickering long enough," Daenerys said, "the wrong thing will come down and find us all at our feasting. I want men with eyes open on the high road and the low, and I want fires set for signals no one will mistake. If I ask the watchmen on the walls, they will do as they have always done. If I ask a woman who has slept in the snow and listened to something that wanted her quiet, she will tell me how not to be a fool." Osha studied her a long time. "You speak like a crow in a tree," she said at last. "Like there's a song you're not singing, but you want the hearers to dance to it anyway." She shrugged. "Very well. You keep a rope ready with knots tied where hands can find them blind. You keep rations near the gate and you don't lock a door to the inner hall with any bolt a small hand can't lift. You keep a lane clear to the godswood and make sure the maids know it like they know their own names. You put a candle in the window of the armory every night and you tell the men if it ever goes out, someone is to take a runner to the kennels. Dogs know things and will tell if you listen." She spat in the pot and laughed at Daenerys's flinch. "That last one's for luck." She did all those things. Ser Roderick snorted at some of them and shook his head at others, but he let her lay the lines of her small defenses across Winterfell like a net a fisherwoman might throw in rough water. Mikken grunted and made her hooks for the ropes and did not ask questions about why she needed 3 and not 2. Hodder carried sacks and smiled and taught her 3 new names for snow in old tongue that made Arya laugh when Daenerys tried to say them. Rickon followed her like a pup, his hair sticking up in odd ends and his pride as bright as a coin whenever she asked him to help. Then came the Ironborn. They came on a morning made for treachery. A still gray light and mist off the hot pools that turned the bailey to a suggestion of itself. The alarm bell never sounded. When Daenerys stepped into the yard to speak with Hallis Malin about the next wagon load of salt fish, She saw Theon Greyjoy's face and did not recognize it. He wore armor that did not belong to him, salt-stained and black, and at his back were men she did not know and did not want to. His smile looked brittle. She thought, absurdly, of a man who had put on a shirt 2 sizes too small and was proud of the fit. "Lady Neria," he said, because he had never been a man to learn the names of those who stood between him and mirrors. "Sweet little thing, have you a welcome for a friend returned?" "You are not a friend," she said quietly. "You are a fool. Winterfell is full of wolves. You should not walk the yard with raw meat." His mouth twitch whitened. Hallis Malin reached for his blade and did not have time to draw. The men behind Theon moved fast. A hand came down like an iron collar on her shoulder. Daenerys did not fight it then. Osha's voice in her ear, "Wait until you can choose the moment." With Theon's men in the yard, Ser Rodrik far afield with most of those old enough to hold a sword, and the small folk gaping in shock, the first breath of the day went to the invaders. The second was harder. Daenerys let her hand shake once as if she were what Theon thought her to be, then met his eyes. "There are children here," she said. "Beginners at sword and mothers at spinning and old men with lungs that wheeze. You do not need to frighten them to look big." "I need Winterfell," he said, and the words snapped a bad string. "I am its master now." "You are a Greyjoy," Daenerys said very evenly. "You are the son of a man who remembers what the North did and will do to Iron Men. Do not behave as if you don't." He called for the banners to be thrown down from the wall and for the kitchens to prepare a feast. He swaggered into the hall and sat in the Lord's chair and commanded a horn of mead and called for the yard to be cleared as if clearing it would return him a self he dimly remembered wanting. Daenerys went where she must and counted what they had. She looked for allies and found quiet eyes in the kitchens and in the kennels, and Hodder's steady gaze, and Osha's feral grin, and a blacksmith's apprentice with hands like the butt ends of hammers who had once cried when a foal died. She counted the children and the paths she had marked in chalk for girls who might have to run blind. Theon declared he held Bran and Rickon. He did not. Bran had gone in the night with Hodder and Osha along the lane she had cleared, knots at his hands and a rope that took them to the godswood where the ground would confound trackers. The cloths she had left in a bag at the root of the weirwood were gone. When Theon brought 2 small dangling forms to the hall to break the spine of Winterfell's will, Daenerys watched his eyes while the boys were displayed and saw that they were not Bran and Rickon. She caught the way his lashes flicked in shame when the wind from the door moved the hair of one dead child and revealed the black beneath the ash. She did not breathe until she could swallow the bile that wanted to rise. "You have made a mistake," she said later in the Solar when he sent for her to see her astonishment at his power. Her voice had the thin high-note steel gets when drawn too fine. Maester Luwin sat in the corner with his hands folded, looking at his chain with so much calm it hurt. "I have made a choice," Theon said. "Men will fear me. They will kneel. They will laugh," Daenerys said. "In their bones. Fear is a poor foundation if men find a reason to laugh. They will give you this hall and not their lives. They will do what you ask when equals watch and do what they want when you turn your back. You think yourself a little lady to advise me," he sneered. "A chit with odd eyes who hides under my—" He stopped. She had not flinched. She let her gaze rest on him the way Lord Eddard might have rested a hand on a pony's neck. "I think myself a loyal subject of the Lord of Winterfell," she said. "And you are not he." When Ramsay Snow came in the night like a smile with knives, Daenerys had the ropes knotted and the lanes clear. She had, because Osha had told her, a basket of dried meat and 2 skins of water hidden under the platform in the old stable that smelled of hay and iron, in case children needed to hide there for 2 days while men with torches lay their ears to the boards. She had a candle ready in Mickon's window and a runner ready by the kennels. A boy who loved dogs more than bread. She had told the maids that if they had to run, they were to go to the godswood and lay flat as if the earth had made them. She had a slow anger coiled between her ribs that felt nothing like the small, sharp angers of childhood. And when she moved, it moved with her and lent weight to her voice. Ramsay was not a man to whom planning mattered once he smelled blood. When Winterfell burned, He hunted Theon like a cat hunts a mouse it has decided to consider a toy. Daenerys got the children out by ones and twos. Hodder carried two at once, and his eyes were full of complicated weather the whole while. Osha slid ghost-like along the walls and appeared with a girl holding a doll and vanished again. Daenerys herself led 5 down into the crypts and counted their breaths, gave them water, told them a story in a whisper of a woman with hair like fire and creatures that had flown once over city and sea. The old story old Nan had never told because it belonged to the wrong sort of past. When she emerged again, smoke laid hands on her throat, and the heat of the great hall was a cruelty. Fires ate at the banners and the rushes. She found Mikken dying with a smile that belonged to a man who had done his work well and could not quite be sorry. She found Luwin under the heart tree, his chain cold as the morning air. He told her to go, and his voice was gentle in the way old things sometimes are when they are too weary to be stern. "Go to the wall," he said, "or to White Harbor, or to the swamps. Go where the wolves are thick. Send to Robb if you can. There are ways to find men when names are mud." She knelt in the red leaves and took his hand and did not weep. He saw what she would ask before she asked it and smiled at her with all his history. "Yes," he said, "keep the name safe until the moment it can be used as a mercy, not a spear. Promise me." "I promise," she said, because she had grown up under the weight of promises made in rooms where children were not meant to be and had learned that promises in the north were steel. They went to White Harbor with Winterfell smoke still in their hair. The road south was a slow coil of grief and motion. Daenerys rode a gray mare she called Silver without letting herself think of why the name fit her tongue so well. Rickon slept draped over Hodder's shoulder. Osha walked like the land belonged to her and nothing in it could hurt her so long as she kept moving. The children did not speak much. Once, in the dusk when the inn at the crook of the road lay behind them and there was no sound but the creak of tack and the breath of the mare, Daenerys said a name to the road. "Daenerys," she said, to see if the sky would crack. It did not. A star came out instead, and because she was not a superstitious girl, she did not pretend it answered. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderly greeted them in a hall vast enough to hold a ship. He had eyes that missed very little and a habit of laughing that made unforgiving things easier to bear. When Osha told him what had been done and by whom, the laugh went out of him as if a door had shut. He stroked his beard and asked sensible questions. He put the children to sleep in rooms with tapestries of ships and made sure there was a dog in each doorway. He fed Daenerys and sat with her after the others slept. The hall too big for the two of them, the sea beyond it coughing its slow, endless story onto the shore. "You are not what you seem," he said, not kindly, not unkindly. "I've lived long enough to know when a face is a mask. I know masks. I wear one myself when I must. You have a secret that isn't small. I do not need to know it, but if it is a secret that could call ships to harbor and swords to hand, it is a dangerous secret to have in a man's hall while another man's knife is pointed at his throat. Speak or swear. I'll accept either." "Do you remember King Aerys?" Daenerys asked wearily. "Not the stories. The man." "I remember his father," Manderly said, "and his father's father. I remember girls with hair like candlelight. I remember men who rode dragons in stories and threw shadows across cities in nightmares. I remember the way the smell of burning clung to men's clothes when they came from King's Landing after the sack. I remember Lord Eddard Stark's face when he came through White Harbor on his way north after burying Lyanna. He did not weep, but salt had dried on him all the same. Why ask me of kings? Because I was born to one, she said simply and watched him. Because nothing in me wants an iron chair and a city that stinks of tar and lies. Because I want a place where winter is not an enemy but a season. I was brought to such a place, and it grew me. Now it is ash. I cannot ask you to love what I am, but I ask you not to throw me back into the sea." Manderly's eyes narrowed. He did not move for a long time. Finally he said, "You have your mother's mouth." "My, Riella," he said, and gave a little grunt like a man testing a step on a stair that might break. "I went once to court when I was younger and slimmer and thought the fat men were always fools. I saw her from far away. She had a mouth like that. It's a dangerous mouth to have. Men will put words into it for you if you let them. Better to choose your own. She chose them carefully. If the north is to live, it must have harbors that do not fear the men sailing into them, she said. It must have ships. If the north is to win, it must not go meekly to the twins like lambs. The Manderleys have ships. You propose to be a sailor now? He lifted a thick brow. You and your little band? I propose to go where I might do more than keep a soup pot from going dry, she said. I know how to hide, my lord. I have done it all my life. I know how to speak to those who need to be spoken to in the way they will hear. Let me ride to Sisterton or to White Knife's mouth and buy grain before winter eats its way up the coast. Let me send ravens to the clans in the hills with words they will not laugh at. Let me stand in a hall when your lesser lordlings sneer and not be cowed by their age. I am small. I am not powerless. He looked at her for a long time and then clapped his hands so sharply the sound bounced from pillar to pillar. The gods send strange gifts, he said. Very well. We shall use you and keep you. We'll scold the gods later for the manner of their giving. She went from White Harbor with letters in a coffer, a seal made for her that bore no name and showed only a small coiled thing that might be a dragon or a serpent or a river curled upon itself. She rode with 3 men whose faces had been on the walls of Winterfell for 20 years and were as familiar as old shoes and as unremarkable. She learned to speak to fishers at the river mouth, so they did not think she wanted to take their winter catch on paper authority. She learned to make a merchant of Sisterton hazard his profit for the promise of more in spring by telling him the truth about what would come if he did not. News came with the gulls. Robb was king in the north. The dire wolf ran before the host, and the young king's sword had taken Jaime Lannister and sent Tywin back like a wave that had broken on a rock. Then came whispers of a wedding fry and debts paid in flesh. Daenerys, while counting bolts of wool, heard a dockman say with relish in his voice that a red rain had fallen upon the twins. She could not eat that night. She went to her room and put her forehead on the cool stone and breathed through the worst of it until she could stand. Then she opened the coffer and took out one of the letters she had not sent because she had not had a name to put at the bottom of it. She wrote to no one and to everyone she loved. We will not all be murdered in rooms. We will not all make bargains with hunger. There are names that do not break even when their holders do. We will live. She found strange allies. On Bear Island, Meej Mormont put a hand the size of a small ham on Daenerys' head and laughed and called her a pretty little ghost and asked if she had the guts to tell a room full of fishermen to put away their boats for a week and slaughter the cattle instead. A bad sea takes men harder than a bad winter, Meej said. You listen when she speaks. She's half ghost and half steel. On the sisters, a narrow woman with a nose like a knife sold her grain she had hoarded on principle and refused to look her in the eye while doing it. I do not want a war, the sister man said. I want simple mischief, the kind that leaves men wet but not dead. Wars ruin mischief for decades. Daenerys smiled and paid her twice what the grain was worth and asked her to teach her to tie the kind of knot that looks like rope even when it is a snake. At Deepwood Motte, she sat before a hearth with a girl with scuffed knees who had learned to command men with a voice still too high and said, one woman to another, I do not want a crown. If any man comes to offer me one, I will throw it back at him and tell him to melt it down for kettles. You say that now, the girl said, but crowns have a way of putting themselves in men's hands and then those hands find your head. I have learned to duck, Daenerys said, and they laughed together. Quiet sound in a hall that smelled of wet wool and stewed bear meat. When winter deepened and the sea froze in the shallows and the sky took on its iron sheen, ravens came with word of men in the night's watch fighting shadows that moved. Jon Snow's name was among them, carried like an ember. Daenerys took the letter in gloved hands and stood in White Harbor's high room while Wyman Manderly waited as if holding his breath. She read and did not let her voice break on his name. He had written little and told less. He had never been a boy of unwise words. He said the wildlings had come in their thousands and that the watch had stood. He said there were things in the woods he had not believed and now did. He said if Winterfell lived, tell it this. Light fires and keep the dogs near, and if a dead thing knocks, do not open. She asked Manderly for ships. Not for swords, she said, for wood and wool and salt beef. And for men who can stand on walls and not shake when the wind makes ghosts of them. I have no king to ask for leave from, Manderley said with a smile like a wound. And the last king I swore to bit the apple's core out and left us to swallow the rot. I'll send what I can. If the Lannisters call me traitor, I'll weigh their charge on the scales where I weigh my feasts. They sent. The White Knife's mouth saw flat-bottomed boats loaded as if for flood and not famine. Daenerys went aboard the last and stood at the prow, the air knifing her cheeks, the taste of salt and iron strong as medicine. She had taken the dye from her hair 2 nights past and watched the pale spill out like moonlight into a basin of brown. Her hood was up. The men of White Harbor saw what they saw and named it luck or superstition or nothing. Secret names meant less than strong rope. And tight seals. Osha sat beside her, gnawing a strip of dried fish, and said without looking, I liked you better with the brown. I am still me with the pale, Daenerys said. Only more so. Osha said, that's what I'm worried about. They made land north of Eastwatch by the sea in water that bit through boots as if leather were a joke and marched with the wind in their lungs. The snow a constant hiss at their feet. At the wall, the night was an abrupt cliff of black and white, and the men on it were as old as stone and as young as Rickon in a single glance. Daenerys stood below that impossible height and felt suddenly very small and exactly the right size, as if the world's proportions had at last been calculated properly. The gate opened reluctantly for the boats they had hauled ashore and dragged on sledges. Men with faces as cracked as river ice shouted her name wrong or right. It did not matter. She spoke to spares, to men who did not look at her hair, to boys whose hands had not yet learned to hide their shakes in their sleeves. She asked where Jon Snow was and got answers that were all winter. He was out, he was back, he was dead, he was not, he was in the woods with a woman with hair like autumn, he was in command and then he was not, it was all a tale told sideways. She did not see him that day, nor the next. She saw men take the wood they brought and build a wall of sharpened stakes within the greater wall, a hedge inside a mountain. She saw dogs set to sniff the air and balk at it. She saw the way firelight made a man look safer than he was. She learned what sound bodies make when they burn because they do not want to rise anymore. On the 3rd day, she climbed to the top of the wall in a cage that creaked with cold and walked the narrow path beyond fear. The world spread out flat and white and wicked, and the sky was a lid. A man stood there with a hood up and a cloak whipping like a tired flag. He turned at her step. His face was a map of all the roads she knew and had chosen not to take. His eyes were the same gray as they had been in Winterfell, when his hands had shaken only after he put down his practiced sword. Narya, he said out of habit, and then the habit cut itself like a rope notched by knives. Daenerys. Jon, she said, and did not go to him because going to him in that moment felt like prayer, and she did not speak to gods when her feet were on a knife's edge 100 fathoms above the world. They held the space between them for a time, as if it were an animal that might be startled and bolt. Around them men cursed the cold in a dozen tongues, and the wind blew the curses away and kept the cold. You shouldn't be here, he said. You should be south, where a winter is a word and not a thing. There is no south, she said, only nearer and farther, and too late. He looked toward the haunted forest. I hate it here, he said. And that was the truth of a boy who had been given a man's work and found it larger than the world he had thought of when he took it. It doesn't care what I do. It will kill me for stepping wrong, and it won't know my name. I know your name, she said. He laughed once, and his breath made a small veil. You always did. They did not speak of who she was. They did not speak of crowns. They did not speak of kings. They spoke of rope and meat and where the hammers should be and how many wolves were needed to make a pack and whether dogs counted. He asked her how she had kept Winterfell a little longer than it wanted to keep itself. She told him about knots that feel like rope and are not. He taught her to tell the difference between a noise made by snow settling and snow being pushed by something moving under it. He told her if she ever found herself between a dead thing and a door, to move sideways, not back. She left the wall with the cages groaning and her skin aching. She carried with her the memory of Jon's mouth when he did not smile and the sense that the world, for all its wrongness, had shifted onto a truer path. She returned to White Harbor, and from there to Deepwood and Bear Island, a silver ghost of a girl whose letters bore no name and were answered in winter with a thing rarer than obedience: trust. It was spring by the calendars of men in the south when a ship came into White Harbor with a hull that rode too high in the water and sails that looked softer than they should. Its captain had hands too smooth for a life spent at sea and eyes that measured her hair and did not flinch. He called himself a trader from Pentos and asked, as if in passing, if he might leave 3 stones of little worth but great beauty with Lord Manderley as a token for his hospitality. Manderley lifted one, and it was heavy as regret and warm where it had taken the sun. Daenerys stood at the far end of the table and saw him see her see it. Pretty? The fat man said, twirling the thing in his hand. Useless rocks are my least favorite kind. They make paperweights, the captain said smoothly. And conversation. Conversation is cheap if you listen in the right places, Manderley said. But very well. 3 baubles for a berth. Leave them and be on your way before the tide makes fools of dockmen. After the man left, Manderley did not turn. He said to no one in particular, some things come when they are meant to come, whether they are needed or not. There is a danger in being the sort of man who thinks the one makes the other. Daenerys did not move. She watched the curve of the stone, the way it ate the light instead of reflecting it. She let herself want it fiercely for a single breath, not because she believed in the old tales, but because her blood moved in a coil when she looked at it, and something in her said yes as surely as a body says yes to warmth after a cold night. Take one, Wyman Manderley said without turning, and his voice was full of all the things he had not said since she had come under his roof. As a token, as a reminder that sometimes what we think died has only slept longer than we knew how to wait. Take it and keep it near something that breathes. She lifted it and the weight went up her arms and into her shoulders. It seemed remarkably ordinary for an object that had littered the ruin of kings and had once, perhaps, been stolen from a fire hotter than forges can make. She took it to her chamber and set it by the brazier. Later that night, when the candles guttered and a draught slipped from the window like a thief, she woke with the sense that something in the room had spoken. It had said nothing she could name. She dreamed of a floor of bone and a ceiling of smoke and of a statue of a woman with a wolf at her feet and a crown made of blood. In the dream, she put her palm to the brow of the statue and felt heat. When she woke, her hand was warm and the stone was not. She laughed at herself and did not tell anyone the dream. The seasons jerked like bad horses. The South called its wars by new names and sent ravens north bleating words. The Lannisters still sat their stolen chair, and the Iron Throne had the sound of something that had been made by men who did not know they were building a trap. In the neck, the Crannogmen talked of spearwives who moved through water like wind and of men who wore their hair in braids not seen since the Age of Heroes. At the wall, men died who had not known they were heroes until after the dying. In White Harbor, sailors learned to tie knots that looked like rope and weren't, and laughed at themselves for believing an old woman's tale about snakes in cordage. Daenerys walked the quilts of the north and made them warm. One night in the godswood of White Harbor, a smaller wood than Winterfell's, but stubborn in its way, the wind went quiet, and the leaves stopped pretending not to listen. Daenerys stood before the heart tree there, less ancient, less scarred than Winterfell's, but no less intent. She thought of Lord Eddard and the promise Luwin had asked of her. She thought of the children in the crypt, of the way Rickon had clung to Shaggy Dog's neck and laughed while the world burned. She thought of the look on Jon's face when he called her by her name, not the one that had been used to protect her, not the one that had kept her hidden because the world cannot bear a thing it does not understand and calls it false. I will not be a spear, she said quietly to the face in the wood. I will not be another knife set in another man's table. If my name is to be used, it will be for mercy. The leaves murmured nothing. She had not expected an answer. She took the egg from the brazier and set it on the grass and pressed her palm to it. It was only warm from the coals. It did not stir. She had not thought it would. She needed it not as a legend but as a weight. If she was to carry a name that had burned a city, she would carry a stone that remembered that heat physically, not only in songs. She returned it to the coals and watched as the firelight played over its curve. She felt the north breathing around her. The city shore smell, the hint of fish oil, the iron in the air. She felt, too, the little quick-moving sun in her chest that had been there since she had learned to sit still by a steaming pool and warm her hands and pretend to tell the old god's secrets that were not yet hers to tell. She had grown under wolves. She had learned from men who thought authority was a quiet thing and from women who knew that a quiet thing can break a house if it is placed in the right spot and leaned on long enough. Letters went south. Some bore sigils. Some bore only a curve like a coiled river. Men and women read them and did not know whose hand had written them, only that what they asked for made sense and cost less in blood than what had been asked of them lately. Ships moved not to war but to grain. Fences were mended in spring because a letter had asked a village to mend them in winter, when wood was scarce and the ground mean with frost and men called that waste. They did it because the letter used a word only a man who had lived under a true winter would use for a drift that covers a door. They did it because the letter said there are more ways to starve than at a table. They did it because the letter promised to send a bag of something pink and pickled that tasted of the seas of the east and made children laugh for the queer of it. And sometimes, in the depths of night, when the wind pulled hard at the windows and Osha's snoring gurgled a little and the candle's flame took the shape of a thing with wings for a bare heartbeat, Daenerys would sit up and feel the name in her mouth like a word she had yet to say properly. She held it there, behind her teeth, and thought of how promises made in godswoods were iron or nothing. When spring finally tried to take hold for good and the roads turned to rivers and men who had thought themselves brave cracked jokes about drowning in ditches, a raven from the wall came with words that were only a handful and heavy as "Come, send all. The dead walk." Daenerys stood with Wyman Manderley in the high room and read them twice. She did not feel fear in the place where a child keeps it. She had put that fear away long ago and replaced it with something that did not have a name. She nodded and made a list and another list and a third. The fat man watched her with moist eyes and said, "Have I ever told you I loved a good plan?" "Yes," Daenerys said and smiled a little. "But never so much as when it makes you feel as if you are eating a second dinner." "That is true," he agreed gravely. "You are wicked." "I am practical," she said. "And hungry." She sent men and wood and salt and iron and thick wool to the wall. She sent a small thing carved of bone to Jon Snow, a token. It had no name upon it and needed none. It was the shape of a wolf with wings, not because she had thought of any prophecy, but because when she had gone to tell a carver what to make, her hand had drawn it on the table in spilled ale without her consent. She had laughed at herself and not stopped him. When she held the thing before it went north, the smooth bone under her thumb felt like the bridge of a living animal's nose, warm in winter. She did not go herself, not that time. The north needed a spine in White Harbor that did not crack when the wind leaned. She stood in the hall with the ship captains and the women who paired houses to spare firewood, and the men who knew which cows had calved and were strong enough to bear a late calf if the spring relented. She stood because the name she carried was too heavy to take where it might be used to break, and because she had promised a dead man under a tree she would use it only for mercy. She remembered a promise made once in a room in a tower where a boy's head had been naked on a pillow and the shaft of light had made dust look like snow. She was a child then, and yet she had learned from a man who had understood the difference between fame and honor. On a night when the aurora lit the northern sky with curtains of green like a palace of the dead swaying, Daenerys went to the godswood with the egg under her arm. She set it on the grass, and her breath made smoke, and the stars watched as they had watched cities burn. She did not make a pyre. She did not cut her hand. She held out her two hands, empty and open. "If there is any justice," she said to the trees and the sky and the stone, "let it fall on the living. If there is any fire, let it warm the cold. If there is any mercy left in the world, give it to those who never had a name to fight for." Wind hissed through the leaves, and the egg sat in the snow. She laughed at herself for the indulgence of the moment and bent to pick it up. Her fingers met the curve and felt something like a heartbeat or the echo of one long gone. It might have been a trick of the blood in her own hands making a pulse against a hard surface. The mind does that when it wants stories, and she was a girl who lived among stories. She did not move for the space of 2 breaths. Then she lifted it and held it to her chest and stood very still until the cold told her she was a fool. When she turned back toward the hall, Osha stepped out from behind a rough-barked tree and said, "If you ever get that thing to hatch, I'm leaving. I'll pack you a bundle," Daenerys said. "With salt. Salt I can find," Osha said. "Sense is rarer. I have sense enough for two," Daenerys said, and they walked back together across snow that held their prints perfectly, as if the world had decided not to waste what had marked it. In the south, men called themselves kings and bled for a chair. In the north, a woman wrote letters no one would boast of answering, and ships brought wool, and boys learned to tell ghost wind from real, and dogs were kept near, and lights were lit between towers in a sequence that, seen from far enough away, spelled out a name only a handful understood. It was not Daenerys. It was Winterfell and what Winterfell had grown. When the army of the living marched, the north moved in patterns it had learned while secretly growing a new kind of thing, a thing that had nothing to do with crowns and everything to do with the discipline of endurance. Daenerys stood at White Harbor and watched work become a kind of prayer. She took from the coffer a seal she had carved and pressed it into wax so that the letters bore a serpent that was also a river that was also perhaps a dragon. She smiled at the thought that had she been born in another time, that seal would have been a kind of joke. Now it was a thing that sent men toward fire with their heads up. A letter from the wall came in Jon's hand, enough to fill her like bread after hunger. "We held. We lost. We will hold again. Bring what you can when you can. If you cannot come, send me your stubbornness." He had never been a man for eloquence. He had been one for truth like iron. She put the letter down and went to the window and spoke to the night as if it were an old nurse. "I will not be a spear," she said again, and held her hands up as if to show they were empty. "I will be a wall." The night did not answer because it had its own work. The sea breathed. Somewhere a babe cried and was soothed. The egg in its brazier sat like a patient promise. It cracked a little that night, a hair's breadth in the curve so faint that in the morning when she lifted it and turned it to the light, she could not tell if it was a flaw in the stone from the beginning or a new line she had never seen. A foolish thing to love, she thought, but most of what she loved had been foolish once. When the war for the dawn bled into the war for what came after, men from the south came north with wagons for bodies and questions. They wanted to know who had sent the ships and who had paid for the salt and how the signals had reached Flint and Skagos both on the same wind. They wanted names to take back to halls where gratitude was a performance and reparations a way of turning gifts into ledgers. Daenerys met them in Wyman Manderly's high room and gave them answers that were only numbers. She was small. She was brown-haired if she had spent time with Dai. She had eyes a man might remember later and call peculiar and then forget. When one man, bolder or more foolish than the rest, lifted the egg from the brazier in his palm, she said with a smile, "Careful, it remembers hotter days." They laughed. Men often laugh when they do not understand a thing and wish to be superior to it. They laughed and left with their questions. She went to the godswood again that evening and put her palm to the heart tree, and then to the egg and then to her own sternum. "I am Daenerys of the House Targaryen," she said to the air that smelled of brine and resin and cold. "I am also the girl who warmed her hands over a pool in Winterfell and learned how to be still. I have two names. I will be both at once." In the years that followed, when the spring truly came like a thing that had fought for the right and men began to say again that winter had been worse in their Father's Day because that is men's way, stories about the woman at White Harbor who had not cared for crowns sifted into the fabric of the North. She married late, and not for a title but a temper and a humor that matched hers. She had no dragons, not the sort that threw shadows across cities. She had ships and people who would stand when she asked without needing to be watched. She visited Winterfell when its walls did not smell of ash and sat beneath the heart tree there and told it in a whisper what had become of the children who had slept between its roots. She traced the names cut into the stone and laid her palm on the smooth worn place at the end of a certain passage where a man's hand had rested too often for any words to be needed. In the deep of one summer that came when even old men conceded the strawberries were sweet as they'd been in their youth, Daenerys returned to the wall with a caravan of wood and wool for repairs to what must forever be watched. She climbed once more to the top in a cage that did not creak so much now that the chains had been tended, and she stood with Jon Snow again. His hair had gone the sort of white men call salt and do not notice darkening again when the wind runs wet hands through it. He had a scar she had not seen before that went under the hairline like a line under a word. He had the same eyes. He had always had them. "It is still ugly," he said of the forest. "It is what it is," she said. He looked at her hands. "You never did bring me a fire-breathing monster. You wouldn't have liked the feeding," she said. "You always did prefer a task that quiets when you do it well." He Snow. "Root, you always did know me too well. We grew under the same roof," she said. "Even if you slept under more rules than I did." "I slept under the right ones," he said. "Mostly." He put his elbows on the parapet and squinted into light so clean it cut. "Do you never wish?" "No," she said, and then laughed at herself. "Yes, for a breath. For the shape of a life that would have been if everything had fallen differently. But then I remember the stones I carry, and the rope knots, and the boys whose names I learned to write without letters on the blades of my hands, and I realized the life I wished for would have made me something softer than this. I like this." She looked at him. "Do you?" "I am still alive," he said. "That is more than I expected. And when a thing comes out of the trees and the dogs bark before the men do, and a boy with hands too big for him remembers to move sideways at the door instead of back, I think maybe we did something right." "It was always going to be sideways," she said. "Nothing in my life has walked straight." He smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. "You have always been sideways, Daenerys." They watched the world together until the light thinned and the cold reached up to remind them what it was. When she went down, she left the egg in its brazier in the room they had given her at Eastwatch. It had a line in it now that any fool could see, a hairline crack like frost on a well in the first bite of winter. She did not put significance on it. She was too busy with wood and wool and men and women, with dogs and boys and letters and ships and the steady plain stubbornness of a land that forgave nothing and therefore taught well. Sometimes at night, when the small hours stretched and the fire was low and her husband snored softly with his hand on her wrist because he had a habit of needing to know she was there even in sleep, she would wake and touch the curve of the egg and think of a city she had never seen except in dreams and of a chair she had never wanted except to smash it and make pots. If the egg ever hatched, hers would be the last face the little thing saw, and it would know in its brief blind old blood that its mother had been raised among wolves. It would know this because everything that came from her knew it. And if it never hatched, if it remained a heavy stone that kept a braider's basket steady and warmed only her hands now and again, it would still be a good thing to have. It would be a promise to herself, made in a godswood with leaves like hands, that there are mercies sharper than spears and names that do not need to be shouts to be heard. On the day she returned to Winterfell once more, years laid over years like fog on a field, she went alone to the godswood and took off her gloves and put her hands as she used to over the steaming water, and for a moment she saw herself reflected there. Hair as pale as a morning moon, eyes that had learned to be gentle, a mouth that had learned to be stern. The weirwood looked down with its old red gaze. She smiled up at it like a child who had learned its letters and brought them back for approval. "I have kept your house, my lord," she told the trees, and did not mind that a piece of her still used that name for the man who had given her a roof and kept a sword between her and the world for as long as had been possible. "I have kept what could be kept. I have let what had to go burn without letting it burn us all. I have done my mending so that it looks as if it was always meant to be there, and I have left the mending where it must show so we do not forget where we tore." Wind moved the leaves. Somewhere a wolf howled, no longer the call to war, no longer the call to guard. It was a sound the North knew how to fold into its sleep and wake to without fear. Daenerys bowed her head and let the steam warm her palms and thought, with a quiet that had taken decades to shape, that she had had two names all along and had learned finally to carry them both without breaking. She thought of a boy with a blade of wood and a man with a wall of ice, and of the very first day she had sat here and measured her breath. She breathed, measured as ever. The pool steamed on. The tree's face watched. The North kept its counsel. And somewhere in her chamber a stone with a hairline crack took the day's warmth into itself, as a hearthstone does, and kept it, and returned it slowly to a room that would be cold in the night if not for such care.